The marketing for the Barbie film was, in my opinion, quite good, making the film seem like it would be a lot of fun. Bright, colourful, wacky, unique, intriguing. It seems now the film is out, it's divided people over what it has to say, and indeed, if it even has anything to say at all, the contention being over whether the film presents a particular political, ideological worldview, and if present, the quality of that presentation. I was really expecting to be more ambivalent about that myself, thinking that if the film did contain such messaging, it would be fairly minimal or ambiguous, focusing more on just having fun with the world, and telling a story that would appeal to a broad audience. But when watching the film, I was very surprised by just how heavy-handed I found the political messaging to be. It relentlessly hammers its message throughout in almost every scene. I feel if I'm to talk about the film at all, I can't avoid talking about this aspect, because the politics really is front and centre, and it would be weird not to mention it. So let's discuss it, and whether it's really as egregious as its most vehement detractors claim. We'll start with the general vibe of the messaging. From the start, the film presents what can easily be interpreted as the typical modern elitist sneering at tradition and motherhood, opening with a criticism of toys that inspire young girls to pretend to be mothers. There's a weird moment in the first act where there's mention of pregnant Barbie, who was discontinued, and all the other Barbies don't like acknowledging her because she's weird to them, so they avoid doing so. An opposing interpretation would be that this pregnant Barbie moment is just a throwaway joke that doesn't mean much, and that the opening remarks about girls pretending to be mothers is not suggesting that doing that and aspiring to motherhood is an entirely bad thing, but rather that it would be nice for girls if they had more choice than just that. More toys to play with that were more varied and invited other aspirations. That's a reasonable enough interpretation, but really the messaging is very confused here. The story prominently features a mother-daughter relationship between Gloria, America Ferrera's character, and her daughter, Sasha. However, her daughter is a vile brat who makes her mother's life sad a lot of the time. This is something which paints motherhood as thankless and undesirable, although these two do resolve their issues and fix their relationship. Overall, the film seems to set up a critique of women's role as mothers in society, and then presents a conclusion that seems to imply some positive sentiment towards the role of motherhood. However, there's no examination of the themes, the cultural evolution of the understanding of women's place as mothers in society versus their place as career people in the modern age, and how these things relate to or conflict with each other. No dramatised dialectic, presenting contrasting worldviews, thesis, antithesis, clashing with each other, in order to arrive at a new thematic synthesis for the film's conclusion. There's no narrative or thematic progression that takes the messaging from the setup to the opposing conclusion. It just jumps from seeming to condemn motherhood at the start to possibly respecting it at the end. I just don't know what we're supposed to take away from that, honestly. Coupled with this unclear messaging, which may lend more credence to the anti-motherhood interpretation, is the omnipresent, cliched, and rather pernicious modern messaging of a particular type of individualism, i.e. that everyone's better off alone, following exclusively their own paths, and that it's better for the sexes to be divided rather than romantically unified. How does this all manifest in the film? Well, we'll go through some of the particulars. Barbie and Ken go from the fake and fantastic world of Barbie Land to the real world, in inverted commas. That's a simple enough concept, but straight away things get messy when they arrive in the so-called real world, because the depiction of the real world is just as ridiculous and unrealistic as Barbie Land. All the men initially encountered are openly, aggressively, cartoonishly misogynistic towards Barbie. Later, we're introduced to Mattel headquarters. The design for the office cubicle floor has an extreme and unrealistic look, soulless, grey and prison-like, as if it's designed to show the coldness of the corporate world. Then we're introduced to the executive boardroom at the top of the building, which by contrast is colourful, with a big heart-shaped desk in the centre of the room. The place is designed like a Barbie environment, with all the executives showing a weird cartoon-like attitude, not acting like real people in any circumstance they're depicted in. They're no different to people in Barbie Land in terms of how realistic their behaviour is. The windows in their boardroom show the Hollywood sign and landscape outside, which is obviously fake, just a 2D backdrop. I suppose you could interpret all this as the corporate world being just as fake as the Barbie world, but that doesn't seem to be connected to any other persistent theme as far as I noticed. To really stretch and extend this film maximum charity, I would say that you could interpret this design language as follows. Some argue that patriarchy primarily benefits a small number of men at the top of society. These types of men are represented on the board of Mattel, which is why their boardroom is similar to something you might find in Barbie Land, because they are the Barbie-like rulers of their world. The rest of the building, where the lower level employees work, is more austere, reminiscent of the kind of existence the Kens experience in Barbie Land. I don't know that that interpretation holds up due to other facets of how the world is presented in the film though. More broadly than that, you could interpret this general similarity of the Barbie world to the so-called real world as a way to suggest that the patriarchal society of our world is just as ridiculous as the matriarchal society in the Barbie world. That if someone came from another world to ours, they would feel like they're in some fake fantasy land, because it's all so absurd. But if that is the intent, I don't really think it works, because the depiction of patriarchy and misogyny in the film is a straw man. It's exaggerated to preposterous lengths, so I don't know what to make of it. It sends very mixed messaging. Okay, let's talk about Ken and men. Poor Ken is rather trampled on in this film. He's set up as a needy, stupid loser who only exists to chase after Barbie. By extension, all the male characters are buffoons without any admirable traits. All the men, like the so-called real world, are clownish caricatures, shown through the gaze of what seems like a juvenile, simplistic worldview of the filmmakers. The term patriarchy comes up more than any other in this film. The film decries patriarchy, and coupling that with the depiction of all the male characters as being ignoble, it's hard not to interpret the film as presenting, to reiterate, just a total straw man of this concept. It depicts a version of our society that doesn't actually exist, and then attacks it as if it does. It's all so odd. When Barbie arrives in the Mattel boardroom, she asks where all the women are, and there aren't any. All the board members are men. Then Will Ferrell's CEO character goes on this awkward ramble trying to justify and sidestep that fact to Barbie. The negative patriarchal implications are obvious. Now, is it the case that all the Mattel board members are men in reality? No. In the real world, Mattel's board has 5 women and 6 men. So that element of the world depicted in this film is not based on anything real. The film is attacking patriarchy with totally made up scenarios like this that the real world runs counter to. Ken's negative behaviours of treating Barbies as lesser and seizing property are only one part of the equation of his transformation. Ken wants Barbie to love him, and he wants liberation from his place at the bottom of society. Both very easy things to understand and empathise with. Even though Ken is kind of the antagonist in this film, and a moron, I think he's the most likeable and compelling character, because he's got the most consistent motivations, among other reasons. There's also a bit of dirtiness, a bit of darkness to his character, which feels more interesting. You understand what he wants very easily, and when he actually embraces his masculinity and takes control of his life, liberating himself from the subjugation of the Barbie-ruled world, turning his whole society upside down, I found he came across as a far more admirable person, no longer only trying to impress Barbie, no longer so servile towards her, no longer powerless. He took her house because she'd been making him live on the beach his entire existence, without a bed or anything. Maybe that horrible bratty girl was right. Maybe Barbie is a fascist in this world. Ken is unintentionally the most heroic character in this film. His achievements are honestly far more impressive than anything the protagonist does. Her motivations are fairly unclear. She just kind of wanders around naively, experiencing things, until deciding she wants to live in the real world at the end. But she's not a particularly active protagonist. The film orbits the potential for some nuance when it reveals that men are just as oppressed in the matriarchal world of Barbie as women are depicted as being in the supposed real world. But it doesn't come into land with this setup. It could have been appropriate here to maybe show that women aren't perfect either, that the world is more complicated than a Barbie fantasy, and that fantasies of female domination, which comprise Barbie Land, are actually maybe not very progressive or culturally beneficial. All that is sort of hinted through the film's resolution, but it doesn't feel like that concept is taken very seriously, more like it's just given lip service, considering the solution arrived at to the societal problems in Barbie Land, which we'll come back to. At the end of the film, the Barbies defeat the Kens by using some interesting manipulation tactics, restoring Barbie Land to a matriarchy. Ken is forgiven for taking over Barbie Land and enlightened to his own agency, but after the relentless bashing of his character throughout, this brief moment at the end just feels like yet more lip service to give him some kind of character arc and posture at some message of coming together societally, without properly following through on that. When the Barbies take over Barbie Land again, the Kens ask President Barbie for equal say in society. She rejects the request, but grants them a sliver of power and the prospect of working their way up to equality over decades to copy the model of women's experience in the real world. With this ending, rather than depicting an idealised new reality that works for everyone, President Barbie inflicts upon the Kens a form of revenge for the historical oppression of women in the real world, which is something the Kens are not responsible for. And she still does this even after having recently experienced, for the first time, the kind of subjugation the Kens had faced for their entire existence. That seems like it would have been a good way to make her grow some empathy for their plight. But no. What kind of message is that? It's an utterly vindictive behaviour on the part of President Barbie. A more charitable interpretation would suggest that this moment reflects the fact that the Barbies are no longer idealised, totally fake figures at this point, but that there has been an element of reality brought to their world, complicating their behaviour a bit. There is going to be a new, more realistic line of plainer Barbies added to their world, which is both symbolically and literally a component of this new cultural change for them. But that interpretation doesn't seem to fit with the context of everything else that happens in the film. To conclude, I was excited for this film, and it has its virtues. It's occasionally amusing, the production design is good, the performances are good, and elements of the basic premise are decent. But alas, I left it feeling, honestly, kind of disgusted by the pernicious messaging on display. The messaging about culture and society feels completely out of date, and it's totally divisive and regressive, pitting the sexes against each other. If you want to make a film about cultural shifts for women and female empowerment, etc., that's perfectly reasonable, but you do a complete disservice to those things by presenting them through such juvenile, lazy, spiteful, hyperbolic framing. I feel like this film risks undoing more social progress than fixing it, by pretending less progress has been made in the real world than actually has been. But anyway, what do you think? I'm genuinely interested to know if you have an opposing interpretation of this film, because it seems there are people who do. Do you like it? Do you agree with what I've said here? Let me know in the comments below, and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching. See you next time.